The air inside Ether didn't smell like a restaurant. It smelled of Wagyu beef, vintage soju, and the kind of heavy, suffocating power that made the rest of the staff breathe in shallow sips. In the center of the room sat Kang Min-jae. To the world, he was a venture capitalist. To the underworld, he was the man who decided who lived to see the sunrise in Manhattan. Everyone avoided his gaze. Everyone, except Aisha Okafor. To the elite patrons, Aisha was just another invisible waitress. A black woman in a crisp, oversized uniform that masked the lean, corded muscle of a tactical operative. She moved with a practiced clumsiness, a clueless shuffle that hid the fact that she was currently mapping every exit and identifying the concealed weapons on Min-jae's bodyguards. She was a ghost, a dead woman from Lagos living a life of quiet service. Then the silence broke. Min-jae shoved the $14,000 leather-bound bill aside with a manicured finger. "I don't pay for mediocre service," he stated, his voice a cold blade. The manager began to tremble. The bodyguards stepped forward. But Aisha didn't retreat. She leaned in, her shadow falling over the untouchable boss. She didn't just pick up the bill. She leaned forward until she was inches from his face, her eyes losing their service worker glaze and hardening into the cold steel of a hunter. "You aren't refusing to pay because of the food, Min-jae," she whispered, her voice a low, melodic threat. "You're refusing to pay because the shell company you used to wash this month's protection money just got flagged by the feds. And you're taking your bad day out on my tip." The restaurant went lethal quiet. The predator had just been poked by a mouse. Only he didn't realize the mouse was holding a detonator. The silence that followed Aisha's whispered revelation was heavy, vibrating with the sudden, sharp shift in the room's oxygen. Kang Min-jae's eyes, usually as unreadable as polished obsidian, widened by a fraction of a millimeter. It was the look of a man who had walked into his own home and found a stranger sitting in his favorite chair, holding a shotgun. But where the master was frozen by shock, the hound was driven by instinct. Junho, the lead bodyguard whose neck was thicker than Aisha's waist, didn't wait for an order. To him, this wasn't an intelligence breach, it was a threat to the king. He moved with the practiced, explosive speed of a professional, his massive hand reaching out to catch Aisha by the throat to slam her onto the mahogany table. He expected a scream, or at the very least, the panicked stumble of a waitress who had realized she'd overstepped. He got neither. Aisha didn't even blink. As Junho's hand closed within an inch of her skin, her clumsy posture vanished. She pivoted on her heel, a movement so fluid and economical it looked like a glitch in reality. In the same heartbeat, her right hand swept toward the service belt at her waist. There was a metallic click-clack. Before Junho could register that his target was no longer there, Aisha's hand slammed downward. The professional-grade waiter's corkscrew, a heavy tool of brushed steel, driven by a precision that ignored the man's bulk, punched through the expensive wool of Junho's sleeve and buried itself 2 inches deep into the solid oak of the table. The sound was a singular, violent thud. Junho let out a guttural grunt of surprise. His momentum jerked to a violent halt. He was pinned. His arm was stretched out across the table, his sleeve anchored to the wood as if by a railroad spike. He tried to pull away, but the leverage Aisha had applied was perfect, locking his elbow in a position that made escape impossible without tearing his own arm. Aisha didn't move back. She remained leaned over the table, her weight balanced perfectly on the balls of her feet. She hadn't even broken a sweat. With her left hand, she reached out and calmly adjusted her thick glasses, which hadn't even slipped during the encounter. "I wouldn't," she said softly, her eyes flicking to the second bodyguard, who had reached for his firearm. "Unless you want to find out how many ways I can use a steak knife before you clear your holster." Min-jae stared at the corkscrew, then at the woman standing over his best man. The shock in his eyes was being rapidly replaced by something else, a terrifying, razor-sharp curiosity. He looked at Aisha not as a servant, but as a weapon he hadn't accounted for. The $14,000 bill was forgotten. The hierarchy of ether had been dismantled in half a second, and for the first time in his life, Kang Min-jae felt the cold breath of a superior predator on his neck. The standoff was broken not by Min-jae's command, but by the sudden rhythmic thwip-thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire shattering the floor-to-ceiling windows of ether. The restaurant's glass walls disintegrated into a million diamond-like shards, spraying the elite clientele in a wave of crystalline debris. Screams erupted, but they were cut short by the terrifying efficiency of the tactical team breaching the perimeter. 4 men in matte black gear and ballistic masks moved with military precision, their submachine guns sweeping the room. These weren't street thugs, they were parks cleaners. Min-jae reached for the weapon tucked into his waistband, but his fingers fumbled, his brain still rebooting from the shock of Aisha's earlier defiance. He was a kingpin, but he was currently a stationary target in a bright spotlight. Down! Aisha roared. The word wasn't a suggestion, it was a physical force. Before Min-jae could react, Aisha's hand was on his shoulder, driving him toward the floor. In her other hand, she snatched a heavy, circular silver serving tray from a nearby station. As the lead assassin pivoted toward their booth, his muzzle flashing with muffled bursts, Aisha didn't cower. She stepped into the line of fire, angling the thick silver tray with the geometry of a shield. The clang-clang-clang of high-velocity rounds striking the metal vibrated through the room, the tray deforming under the impact but holding firm. "Move. Now," she commanded, grabbing Min-jae by the collar of his designer suit and dragging him toward the service doors. She didn't run like a victim, she retreated like a rearguard, keeping her body between Min-jae and the shooters, the tray absorbing the lead that was meant to end the Kang dynasty. Her movements were a blur of calculated violence. When a gunman tried to cut them off by the bar, she didn't wait for him to aim. She launched the dented silver tray like a lethal frisbee. It caught the man squarely in the throat, the heavy edge collapsing his windpipe and sending him crashing into a display of expensive cognac. They burst through the double-swinging doors of the kitchen, the heat and the scent of garlic a sudden, jarring contrast to the cold death in the dining room. Aisha kicked a heavy prep table over, creates a barricade before the doors could even settle. Min-jae slumped against a stainless steel counter, gasping, his face splattered with the blood of his fallen guard and the dust of shattered glass. He looked up at Aisha, who was already scanning the kitchen for makeshift weapons, her eyes darting with a terrifying, predatory intelligence. "You're not a waitress," he wheezed, the realization finally anchoring in his mind. Aisha didn't look back as she grabbed a heavy chef's knife and a canister of industrial degreaser. "And you're not the king of New York anymore, Min-jae. You're just a man with a target on his back. If you want to keep it from becoming a hole, stay behind me." The stainless steel sanctuary of the walk-in freezer slammed shut, muffling the chaotic symphony of gunfire and breaking porcelain to a dull, rhythmic thumping. The temperature plunged instantly, but Aisha didn't shiver. She moved with a frightening mechanical precision, her eyes scanning the hanging carcasses of beef and the frozen crates of produce as if they were an armory. Min-jae collapsed against a rack of expensive ribeyes, his chest heaving. His hand pressed against a jagged tear in his shoulder where a glass shard had sliced through his silk shirt. He watched, transfixed, as Aisha didn't reach for a phone to call for help. Instead, she grabbed a heavy-duty meat hook and a roll of industrial-strength plastic wrap. With a speed that defied the numbing cold, she lashed the meat hook to the end of a shortened broom handle, layering the plastic wrap until the bond was as rigid as steel. She then took a canister of pressurized cooking spray and taped it to the side of a butcher's knife, creating a crude but effective incendiary device. "Who are you?" Min-jae rasped, the cold air turning his breath into ghostly plumes. No waitress knows how to breach point a kitchen or create a tactical shield out of a silver tray. Aisha didn't look up. She tested the weight of her makeshift flail, her shadow stretching long and jagged against the frosted walls. "Aisha Okafor is a name on a forged passport, Min-jae. The woman you tried to bully tonight died 3 years ago in a black site outside Lagos." She stepped closer, the flickering fluorescent light reflecting off her thick glasses, which now seemed less like a disguise and more like a visor. "I didn't learn to fight in some high-end Manhattan boxing gym or a suburban dojo. I was the lead operative for the Nigerian Special Forces, the 72nd Mobile Strike Group. I was trained to dismantle regimes in the dark." Min-jae's jaw tightened. He had spent his life surrounded by killers, but they were all men who fought for money or ego. The woman standing before him fought with the practiced indifference of a machine. "They think I'm a ghost," she continued, her voice dropping to a low, lethal hum. "And if Park finds out I'm alive, he won't just be coming for your throne. He'll be bringing an army to finish what my government started. So, you have two choices: sit here and freeze while they find you, or follow me and see why they called me the Shadow of the Sahel." She handed him a heavy kitchen cleaver, handle first. It was a silent pact. For the first time in his career, the King of New York wasn't the one giving orders. He took the blade, his fingers numbed by the cold, and nodded. Aisha turned toward the heavy freezer door, her posture shifting into a low, predatory crouch. The hunt had officially reversed. The heavy service door of the kitchen burst open, and they were instantly swallowed by the roar of a Manhattan thunderstorm and the scream of sirens. The alleyway was a canyon of wet brick and steam. Park's men were already rounding the corner, their muzzle flashes illuminating the rain in strobe-like bursts. "The Maybach key!" Aisha shouted over the thunder. Min-jae pointed a shaking finger at the matte black beast idling near the curb, its reinforced glass shimmering under the streetlights. He fumbled for the fob, but Aisha snatched it from the air before it could hit the ground. She didn't head for the passenger side. She shoved Min-jae into the rear seat and dove into the driver's chair. As she slammed the ignition, the V12 engine purred to life, a low, predatory growl that signaled the end of the conversation. "Buckle up, Mr. Kong," she muttered. "This isn't a limo ride." She threw the car into reverse, slamming into a dumpster to create a gap, then floored the accelerator. The armored Maybach lurched forward, tires screaming against the slick asphalt as she drifted onto Fifth Avenue. Two black SUVs immediately swerved out of the shadows, falling into pursuit. Aisha didn't drive like a chauffeur, she drove like a kinetic mathematician. She didn't look at the road, she looked at the gaps, the angles, and the timing of the traffic lights. When the first SUV attempted to pit maneuver them, Aisha didn't steer away. She tapped the brakes, let the attacker's bumper slide alongside, and then slammed the steering wheel hard to the right. The weight of the armored Maybach acted like a sledgehammer, sending the SUV spinning into a row of parked cars in a spectacular spray of sparks and glass. Min-jae gripped the leather upholstery, his stomach left somewhere 3 blocks back. He watched Aisha in the rearview mirror. Her hands were light on the wheel, her eyes calm, almost bored, as she threaded the needle between a city bus and a delivery truck at 90 miles per hour. "Where did you learn to drive like this?" he wheezed, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Abuja," she said, her voice steady as she jinked the car through a narrow alleyway that seemed inches too tight for the frame. "When the militia is behind you and the road is made of dirt and landmines, you learn how to make a car fly." She executed a perfect J-turn, spinning the heavy sedan 180 degrees to face the final pursuer head-on. For a heartbeat, it was a game of chicken. The assassin in the SUV flinched first, swerving to avoid the collision. Aisha didn't miss the opening. She accelerated past them, disappearing into the neon-blurred labyrinth of the Lower East Side, leaving the reach of the Korean syndicate in her rearview mirror. The Maybach eased into a crumbling side street in Bed-Stuy, its engine purring like a weary predator. Aisha killed the lights 2 blocks early, navigating by the dim glow of street lamps reflecting off rain-slicked brick. She pulled into a narrow, weed-choked driveway beside a dilapidated brownstone that looked like it hadn't seen a tenant since the 70s. "This is it?" Min-jae asked, wincing as he clutched his bleeding shoulder. He looked at the boarded-up windows and the peeling paint with the disdain of a man who slept on 500 thread-count silk. "I've seen better-looking crack dens." "Good," Aisha snapped, scanning the rooftops before killed the ignition. "That means the professionals won't look twice." She led him through a basement entrance hidden behind a rusted iron gate. To any observer, it was a damp, forgotten cellar. But when Aisha pressed her thumb against a recessed brick near the boiler, a soft chime echoed through the dark. A section of the wall, reinforced steel disguised as crumbling masonry, slid open with a hydraulic hiss. As they stepped inside, the hum of servers replaced the sound of the rain. The interior was a jarring contrast to the ruin outside. The air was climate-controlled and crisp, smelling of ozone and high-end electronics. The apartment was a single, open-concept tactical hub. One wall was dominated by a bank of ultra-thin monitors displaying live feeds from every street corner around the restaurant and Min-jae's known properties. On a central workbench, disassembled drones lay beside encrypted satellite phones and various passports. This wasn't a home, it was a command center. "Sit," Aisha commanded, gesturing toward a medical cot in the corner. She didn't wait for him to comply before she was at a terminal, her fingers flying across a mechanical keyboard with a rhythmic, staccato click. Min-jae sank onto the cot, his eyes roaming over a topographical map of New York glowing on the main screen, overlaid with flickering red dots. "You've been tracking my organization," he realized, his voice low. "The routes, the dead drops, the port schedules. You weren't just hiding here, Aisha. You were watching me." Aisha paused, her silhouette framed by the blue light of the monitors. She looked over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. "I was watching everyone, Min-jae. In my line of work, you don't survive by trusting that the world has forgotten you. You survive by knowing exactly when the shadows start moving." She pulled up a high-resolution thermal feed of the Ether restaurant. The red heat signatures of Park's men were still visible, scouring the debris. "Now," she said, her voice hardening, "let's find out why your second-in-command decided tonight was the night to retire you." Aisha didn't bother with a medical kit. She moved to a cabinet and pulled out a bottle of high-proof whiskey and a roll of gauze, tossing them onto the cot next to Min-jae. "Clean the wound," she ordered, her voice already distant as she plugged Min-jae's encrypted phone into a decryption rig on her desk. Min-jae hissed as the alcohol bit into his skin, but his eyes never left her. "That phone has biometric locks and a triple-layer firewall," he warned. "If you fail the sequence, it wipes the drive and sends a GPS ping to my security team." "Your security team is currently trying to kill us," Aisha replied, her fingers dancing across a transparent glass keyboard. "And your firewall was written by a developer who likes to recycle his subroutines. I've seen this architecture in 3 different government databases." A cascade of green code washed over Aisha's face as the phone's screen flickered and then surrendered. She didn't look at his private photos or his bank accounts, she went straight for the hidden partitions. Within seconds, a series of outgoing pings appeared on the main monitor, mapped against a timeline of the evening. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a recurring signal. "Every time you made a move tonight, when you left your penthouse, when you arrived at Ether, even when you sent the wine back, a data packet was sent from your device. Not to your office, but to a secure server owned by the Department of Justice." Min-jae stood up, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. He stared at the logs, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Impossible. Only I have access to those logs. Me and your underboss, Park," Aisha finished. She pulled up a secondary screen, showing a cloned SIM card active in the Midtown area. "The $14,000 bill wasn't an insult, Min-jae. It was a trigger. Park knew you'd make a scene. He knew it would keep you stationary in a glass-walled room for at least 20 minutes. The refusal to pay gave the feds the probable cause they needed to monitor the premises, and it gave Park's hit squad the window they needed to ensure you didn't leave alive." The realization hit Min-jae like a physical blow. He wasn't being hunted because he was strong. He was being hunted because he had been betrayed by the man he called a brother. Aisha's monitors suddenly turned red, a sharp alarm echoing through the room. A GPS map of Bed-Stuy flickered to life, showing 3 blacked-out vans turning the corner 2 blocks away. "He didn't just sell your routes, Min-jae," Aisha said, grabbing a tactical vest from the wall. "He sold your life. And since I'm the one holding your phone, he just sold mine too. They're here." The sirens of the tactical vans were cut short, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thuds of boots hitting pavement outside. They had minutes, maybe less. But as Aisha grabbed a fresh roll of medical tape and a bottle of antiseptic, she looked at Min-jae's shoulder and realized he wouldn't make it past the first floor if he went into shock. "Sit," she commanded. It wasn't the voice of a waitress anymore. It was the bark of a field medic in a hot zone. Min-jae slumped back onto the cot. The adrenaline that had carried him through the neon-blurred streets of Manhattan was evaporating, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. He watched as Aisha knelt before him, her movements devoid of any hesitation or softness. She used a pair of trauma shears to cut away the ruined remains of his $5,000 blazer, exposing a jagged, angry graze where a 9mm round had kissed his bicep. She poured the antiseptic directly onto the wound. Min-jae let out a sharp, hissing breath, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the cot. "Steady," she muttered, her eyes locked on the task. She began to wrap the gauze with a tension that was firm but precise, her fingers moving with a dexterity that spoke of hundreds of similar injuries tended to under worse conditions. As she worked, the blue light of the surveillance monitors reflected off her glasses. Min-jae looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the faint, silvery scar running along her hairline, the stillness in her posture that suggested she was listening to the house's structural integrity even while she bandaged him. He realized then that the $14,000 bill at the restaurant hadn't just been a petty display of his power, it had been a death warrant he'd signed for himself. If she hadn't been there, if he had successfully intimidated her into silence or had her fired, he would currently be a corpse cooling on the floor of ether. He, the King of New York, was alive solely because a woman he had dismissed as a servant had chosen to exercise mercy. The power dynamic didn't just shift, it shattered. The wealth, the lineage, and the fear he commanded meant nothing in this basement. Here, the only currency was competence, and Aisha was the wealthiest person he had ever met. "Why?" he rasped, his voice cracking. "Why save me? You could have walked out the back door and let Park have his throne." Aisha finished the knot on the bandage and finally looked up. Her expression was hard, but there was a flicker of something ancient and weary in her eyes. "Because Park is a vulture. And in my experience, the only thing worse than a predator you know is a scavenger who thinks he's earned the right to lead. Now, stand up. We have to kill the lights." She stood, grabbing 2 customized submachine guns from a hidden locker. She didn't offer him one. She didn't need to. She was the weapon. He was just the cargo she was no longer willing to lose. The skyline of Manhattan was a jagged silhouette against the bruising purple of the midnight sky. Park's private gala at the plaza was an exercise in stolen opulence, a room full of traitors celebrating a coup that wasn't yet finished. Park stood at the center of it, holding a glass of Cristal, unaware that the 2 ghosts he had tried to bury were currently perched on the adjacent rooftop. "The distraction must be loud," Aisha whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. She was no longer a waitress. She was encased in matte black tactical gear, her frame transformed into a lethal shadow. "Park needs to believe you're desperate. He needs to see the king falling apart." Min-jae adjusted the earpiece. He was dressed in his finest suit, but beneath the silk, he carried the cold weight of a compact submachine gun and the resolve of a man who had already died once. "And you?" "I'll be the silence that follows the noise," she replied. The gala erupted into chaos 60 seconds later. Min-jae didn't sneak in, he crashed the front doors, firing a burst into the crystal chandelier. The massive fixture plummeted, shattering on the marble floor like a frag grenade of glass. "Park!" Min-jae's voice roared through the hall, dripping with a calculated, manic rage. "You want the throne? Come and take it from the man who built it." Park's security detail swarmed the floor, drawn like moths to the flame of Min-jae's loud, aggressive entry. They focused entirely on the disgraced boss, pinning him behind a fallen grand piano. They expected a desperate last stand. They didn't expect the ceiling. Aisha dropped from the ventilation shaft with the grace of a predatory cat. She didn't use a gun. The sound would give away her position. Instead, she moved with absolute efficiency, her hands wielding a pair of tactical karambits that hummed through the air. She was a whirlwind of dark silk and sharpened steel. She moved behind the primary fire team, her movements a blur of biomechanical precision. A strike to the carotid, a snap of a radial nerve, a heel driven into a temple. She dismantled 5 men in 11 seconds. Each movement was a masterclass in economy. She didn't waste a single breath or a single inch of motion. Park turned, his face draining of color as he saw his elite guards falling silently, as if the shadows themselves were reaching out to claim them. He raised his gold-plated revolver, but a flash of black crossed his vision. Aisha was there, her hand locking his wrist in a grip that felt like industrial pliers. "The bill is due, Mr. Park," she whispered, her eyes cold and terrifyingly empty. With a sickening crunch, the revolver hit the floor. The ghost protocol was complete. The room was silent once more, the only sound the heavy, rhythmic thud of Min-jae's boots as he stepped out from behind the piano to reclaim what was his. The golden luster of the plaza's ballroom had been replaced by a clinical, terrifying stillness. Park lay on the marble, his empire collapsing in the time it took for his breath to rattle against his broken ribs. Min-jae stood over him, not with the manic rage of a street thug, but with the cold, absolute finality of a restored king. He didn't fire a single shot. He didn't need to. The sight of Aisha standing behind him, her blades dark and her expression empty, was a more effective sentence than any bullet. Weeks later, the shattered glass of ether had been replaced by reinforced, high-tensile crystal. The scent of wagyu and ozone remained, but the atmosphere had shifted. The staff no longer trembled, and the patrons spoke in hushed tones of the night the invisible waitress saved the underworld. Min-jae sat at the same center booth where the defiance had begun. He looked different. The arrogance that had once defined his silhouette had been replaced by a razor-sharp focus. He was a man who had looked into the abyss and been pulled back by a hand he had once tried to slap away. Aisha approached the table. She wasn't wearing the oversized, clumsy uniform anymore. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that complemented the lethal grace of her posture. Her glasses were gone, revealing eyes that no longer needed to hide their predatory weight. Min-jae didn't flick the leather folder this time. He placed it on the table with deliberate respect and pushed it toward her. Inside was a check, but the numbers trailing the 1 and the 4 didn't stop at 3 zeros. It was a sum that bought more than just silence. It bought a legacy. Beside it lay a legal contract, a 50-50 partnership in his newest venture, a private security and intelligence firm that would operate in the cracks of the city. The 14,000 was a debt, Min-jae said, his voice steady and low. This is an investment. I spent my life thinking power was something you took. You taught me it's something you recognize. Aisha looked at the check, then at the man who had finally learned to see her. She didn't smile, but the tension in her shoulders, the weight of 3 years spent as a ghost, finally ebbed away. She wasn't a waitress hiding from a death sentence in Lagos anymore. She wasn't a mouse in an oversized apron. She picked up the folder and tucked it under her arm. "I'm not going back to the kitchen, Min-jae." "I wouldn't dream of it," he replied, standing to walk beside her. "The kitchen was too small for you. The city is just the right size." As they walked out of ether together, the doors swinging shut on their shared past, Aisha Okafor finally stopped running. She was no longer a ghost. She was the shadow of the king, and in the New York underworld, that was the most dangerous thing anyone could be. Debt paid. In full.